Everyone believes the Romans were masters of civilization, builders of roads, aqueducts, and law. But what they did to Christian mothers inside their arenas was so horrific that ancient chroniclers refused to record it in full. For centuries, those who dared to describe it vanished under imperial silence. What you're about to hear was worse than death itself. If you want to uncover history's darkest secrets, subscribe now. Because by the end of this video, you'll never see the Roman Empire the same way again. Everyone in Rome loved the games. They said they were the lifeblood of the empire, a display of strength, order, and divine justice. But behind the roars of the Colosseum, the marble, and the gold, there was something far darker. Something that no Roman poet dared to describe. It began in the reign of Nero. When the Great Fire consumed nearly half of Rome in 64 AD, the emperor needed someone to blame. His citizens whispered that he had ordered the fires to clear land for his new palace. To silence them, he turned to a growing sect that refused to honor the Roman gods, the Christians. They were easy targets. Poor. Foreign. Strange. They met in secret, refused to sacrifice to Jupiter, and called each other brother and sister. To the Romans, that was enough to mark them as enemies of the state. At first, Nero ordered public executions, simple crucifixions along the Appian Way. But the crowds grew bored. So the emperor's advisors suggested something more theatrical. They would turn punishment into entertainment. Historical accounts, especially from Tacitus, describe a night in Nero's private gardens where Christian prisoners were tied to stakes and set on fire to light his feasts. Among them were women, mothers who begged the guards to spare their children. But mercy was not part of the show. The people clapped. The torches burned. And the empire discovered something new, the power of spectacle through suffering. The next day, the amphitheater filled again. It wasn't just criminals who entered now. It was mothers, fathers, and even children, all condemned for refusing to bow before the emperor's gods. Soldiers led them through the corridors beneath the arena, where the air reeked of blood and wet sand. From above, the crowd chanted for blood. The women were told their children could live if they recanted their faith. But most stayed silent. When the gates opened, the sunlight flooded in like a curse. The roar of thousands hit them like a storm. And then came the beasts. The Romans didn't simply kill, they choreographed death. Lions starved for days were released into the pit. Spectators watched, wine in hand, as the animals tore through flesh and fabric. The screams blended with the cheers until no one could tell the difference between pain and pleasure. To the empire, it was justice. To history, it was something else entirely. One chronicler, unnamed, perhaps fearing retribution, wrote that one mother, a woman called Aurelia, held her child even as the lion approached. She didn't scream. She whispered a prayer. When soldiers pulled what was left of her from the sand, the crowd had already moved on to the next show. But not everyone forgot. Some of the guards refused to return to duty. Even among the hardened, there were whispers that these people, these so-called criminals, met death with a kind of peace that unsettled the entire city. And the emperors noticed. For every Christian who died, more seemed to rise in their place. The Colosseum had become a factory of faith. Rome's cruelty was not silencing them, it was feeding them. Nero's advisors warned him that fear alone couldn't destroy belief. But the emperor didn't listen. He ordered new methods. More public. More humiliating. More inventive. And soon, every governor across the empire learned that Rome didn't just want to kill Christians. It wanted to erase them, body, memory, and legacy alike. The sand of the arena had turned red countless times before, but never like this. Because for the first time, Rome wasn't fighting an army. It was fighting an idea, and losing. But this was just the beginning. After the Great Fire of Rome, the city smelled of ash and fear. Marble melted into blackened stone, temples stood hollow, and thousands were homeless. The people whispered that Nero had watched it burn from his palace balcony, playing his lyre while flames swallowed the capital. He needed an enemy, someone the crowd could hate more than him. So his advisors named one. The Christians, they said. They speak of another kingdom. Another king. That was all the emperor needed. At dawn, soldiers dragged entire families from the city slums, men, women, children, even the sick. They were accused not of arson but of atheism, refusing to worship the gods of Rome. To deny the gods, Nero claimed, was to destroy the state itself. But the punishments that followed had nothing to do with justice. Tacitus, the Roman historian, records what happened next. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the hides of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or set aflame to serve as night lamps when daylight had expired. It wasn't execution. It was theater. The amphitheater became a furnace of screams. Mothers were stripped and tied to wooden stakes, oil poured over their skin as musicians played softly in the background. Children watched from the shadows of the arena's tunnels, clutching each other, their small hands covering their ears as the torches were lit. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the perfume that nobles wore to mask it. But the horror went deeper. Nero's court philosophers argued that Christians weren't human, that they were a disease, a corruption of the Roman soul. The emperor's sculptors carved new statues of Jupiter and Mars with broken crucifixes under their feet, a warning to anyone who dared whisper the forbidden name of Christ. At night, the bodies of the burned were collected and thrown into the Tiber. Yet when dawn came, more Christians appeared, kneeling, praying, refusing to hide. It infuriated Nero. He demanded creativity. He wanted deaths no one could forget. That was when the theater of torment began, a series of shows designed to mock faith itself. One account describes a woman named Livia, a Christian mother imprisoned for months. Nero ordered her to be brought into the arena dressed as the goddess Venus, her body painted in gold, her eyes covered with a silk blindfold. When she was led before the crowd, he announced that this Venus had betrayed the gods and would be punished by them. Then, before tens of thousands, wild bulls were released. The audience roared as Livia screamed, not in terror, but in prayer. Witnesses said her last words were for her child, who had been forced to watch from the stands. When the beasts were done, Nero smiled and said, "The gods are entertained." But not everyone laughed. A few senators left the amphitheater in silence. One, Gaius Plinius Secundus, later known as Pliny the Elder, wrote privately that Rome had turned from justice to madness. "They die willingly," he observed, "and that terrifies me more than their defiance." Even some soldiers began to waver. Many were assigned to scour the catacombs where Christians hid, but they returned shaken, describing the eerie calm of those who prayed in the dark, awaiting capture as if welcoming it. The emperor grew paranoid. He believed the Christians' peace was a kind of curse. He ordered that any mother who refused to renounce her faith should watch her children taken from her and raised by pagan priests. It was not just a physical purge, it was psychological warfare. Nero wanted to erase the Christian mother, body, and soul. By the end of his reign, the prisons were overflowing. Executioners worked in shifts. The cries from the Circus Maximus carried across the city, mingling with laughter and song. Rome had become addicted to cruelty. But something strange began to happen. The more blood the empire spilled, the more its own citizens began to question it. Ordinary Romans whispered that these people, the ones they were told to despise, died with too much grace to be evil. In Nero's final months, before his suicide, he reportedly confessed to a servant that he heard the cries of the burned in his sleep. "They pray for me," he muttered. "Even now, they pray for me." When he died, the persecutions did not. They spread, across provinces, across generations, refined by new emperors and perfected by imperial engineers. And soon, cruelty became invention. The empire no longer killed for spectacle. It killed for precision. But it gets worse. When Nero died, Rome did not stop hunting the followers of Christ, it only learned to do it with method. The new emperors wanted to appear more rational, more orderly, yet the cruelty simply changed its shape. Domitian began with decrees. Anyone accused of atheism, meaning disbelief in the Roman gods, could be tried without evidence. Governors turned religion into paperwork. The persecution became a system. Names were written on scrolls, stamped with wax, and sent to provincial offices across the empire. In theory it was justice. In practice it was a purge. The prisons filled with those who refused to swear loyalty to the emperor's divinity. The empire learned that it could break people not only through pain, but through fear of invisibility. Records were erased, property confiscated, and families forbidden to speak the condemned names. It was as if entire lives had been deleted from history. Letters discovered in the ruins of Pompeii hint at this silence. One citizen wrote that a neighbor had vanished for the new faith, and that his home was sealed, as though death itself lived there. Under Emperor Trajan, governors like Pliny the Younger asked what to do with those accused of being Christian. Trajan's answer was cold and administrative: do not hunt them, but if accused and proven, they must be punished. Bureaucracy had replaced rage, cruelty was now an office procedure. Then came Decius, almost 2 centuries later. He believed the empire was collapsing because the old gods were forgotten. To restore them, he required every citizen to prove their devotion by sacrificing to the gods in public. Those who did were given a certificate, a libellus, as proof of loyalty. At first it sounded harmless. But for Christians, to offer even a grain of incense to Jupiter was betrayal. When they refused, the empire struck. The libellus system became Rome's most efficient weapon. It forced conscience into a corner, faith or survival. Mothers were brought before magistrates, holding their infants as officials demanded a single gesture: drop the grain, burn the incense, take the paper. Many hesitated, some complied in tears. Others refused and disappeared into the endless chain of prisons. Historians later called this the bureaucratic terror, a machine powered not by swords but by ink. Meanwhile, architects and engineers built new facilities beneath civic buildings, quiet, windowless, meant for questioning and confinement. They called them specula, watch places. They were not for execution but for intimidation. No screams, no spectacle, only the slow breaking of resolve. The Roman Empire had discovered something more enduring than violence: control through obedience. Across the Mediterranean, reports circulated of entire villages abandoning trade rather than obtain the libellus. Merchants refused to sell goods, children vanished into the catacombs, and towns that once rang with festivals fell silent at dusk. Archaeologists have found scratched symbols on the walls of these underground refuges, simple marks of fish, crosses, and letters intertwined. Each one was a message: we were here. We still believe. To the empire, they were criminals. To each other, they were proof that truth could outlive fear. By the 3rd century, Roman officials realized they had created a paradox. Every act meant to erase the faith only recorded it deeper into memory. Chronicles written by pagan observers admitted it openly: the more they are suppressed, the more they multiply. The persecution had become a mirror, reflecting Rome's own decay. The empire that once prided itself on order was now driven by superstition and fear. And still, the emperors believed they could contain belief as if it were a rebellion. But the real rebellion was spiritual and unstoppable. Because what the empire could not see was that the faith of those hidden families, the quiet prayers in the catacombs, were already shaping the future that would one day outlive Rome itself. Little did they know, the real horror was yet to come. Beneath the streets of Rome lies another city, one carved not from marble but from silence. A labyrinth of tunnels stretches for miles under the Appian Way, where early Christians buried their dead and hid from the eyes of the empire. To the Romans above, the ground was solid. To those below, it was sanctuary. By the 3rd century, these catacombs had become more than burial sites. They were schools, temples, and homes. Families carried oil lamps shaped like doves, their faint glow painting trembling halos on the walls. Here, mothers whispered hymns so softly that even the echo dared not speak. Children grew up learning to walk quietly, to pray in the dark, to read scripture written on fragments of parchment smuggled from the surface. The empire called them fugitives. They called themselves faithful. Archaeologists who explored these tunnels centuries later described strange patterns scratched into the walls: circles, fish, palm branches, the letter P crossed by an X. Each mark was a secret sign, proof that a believer had lived and died there. Some chambers hold hundreds of names, each one accompanied by a small message in Latin: in pace. In peace. But peace was fragile. Imperial patrols began searching the outskirts of the city, following rumors of underground gatherings. Those caught entering the tunnels faced interrogation, exile, or worse. Yet still they came. They descended by candlelight, carrying bread and wine, whispering the words of communion. To stand in those tunnels today is to feel the weight of centuries pressing down. The walls absorb the stories that Rome tried to erase. One inscription found in the catacomb of Priscilla reads, "She sleeps in Christ, having raised her child in faith." The handwriting is uneven, as if carved in haste. Nearby, a child's name appears, smaller, fainter, almost hidden. It suggests what historians have long suspected, that entire families lived and died here together, never again seeing the sunlight above. Yet, even in this darkness, there was light. Artists painted on the ceilings with soot and ochre, images of shepherds carrying lambs, of women holding children beneath stars. These were not works of rebellion, but of memory. Each stroke was an act of defiance, saying, "We will not be forgotten." When Emperor Decius renewed the persecutions, many of these underground communities vanished. Entrances were sealed. Passages collapsed. Some were lost for over a millennium. In the 19th century, when archaeologists rediscovered them, they found traces of oil lamps and fragments of bread carbonized by time. One chamber held small vessels that had once contained milk. Scholars believe these belonged to mothers who nursed their infants in hiding. The catacombs became a frozen moment in history, a place where terror and tenderness coexisted. What frightened Rome most wasn't what happened underground, but what it symbolized. The empire's control ended at the surface. Beneath its foundations, an invisible world was growing, one that no decree or sword could touch. And then came the rumors. Legends spread that ghosts wandered the catacombs, that those who entered without faith lost their minds. Guards refused patrols at night. Merchants warned their apprentices never to step near the old entrances, saying that the air itself whispered the forbidden name. It was fear, not faith, that now haunted Rome. For the first time, the empire seemed aware that its greatest enemy was not rebellion, but remembrance. The stories of these hidden families, passed from generation to generation, began to reshape the conscience of the very world Rome had built. Centuries later, when the persecutions finally ended, the catacombs emerged not as relics of defeat, but as monuments to endurance. Still, among the thousands of inscriptions, one message stands out. It reads, "They thought us dead. We were only waiting." But the real secret of what Rome did to erase these people, the one uncovered by modern historians, was still buried in sealed archives, hidden by those who feared the truth would shake the empire's legacy. And that truth is what comes next. History remembers emperors by their statues and armies by their victories. But the forgotten are remembered differently, through fragments of parchment, initials carved into stone, and lullabies sung in languages no one speaks anymore. When scholars in the late 19th century explored the sealed chambers of the Roman catacombs, they didn't just find graves. They found records. Hidden behind a false wall in the catacomb of Domitilla, excavators uncovered clay jars sealed with wax. Inside were scrolls written in early Latin and Greek, letters, diaries, and prayers. Most were damaged beyond recognition. But a few lines survived. They told of mothers who risked everything to keep their faith alive, and their children hidden. One letter, written in trembling handwriting, began, "If they find us, they will take the children first. But I have taught mine to sing softly, even in darkness." Historians believe this was written by a woman named Unia, sometime around 258 AD, during the persecution under Emperor Valerian. Her words echoed across time, defying the silence that Rome tried to impose. The scrolls described entire families forced underground, not because they rebelled, but because they refused to renounce a belief in mercy, forgiveness, and hope. These were not revolutionaries. They were ordinary people caught between faith and fear, between empire and eternity. For centuries, Rome had claimed to be the light of civilization. But deep beneath its marble, the truest light flickered in the hands of women no one would ever name. One account described the mothers of the bread. They were widows and servants who secretly baked communion bread for the hidden congregations. The penalty for such an act was death. Yet they continued, disguising the loaves as offerings to Roman gods so the guards would not question them. Another scroll mentioned the milk of mercy, vessels of milk left beside infants buried in the tunnels. The mothers believed their children would wake in a kinder world. For generations, the empire's historians omitted these stories. Christian chroniclers, too, often forgot the women, focusing instead on bishops, martyrs, and emperors. But the truth lived on, in whispers, in the songs of the early church, in the quiet endurance of those who had no power except love. When modern researchers examined the catacombs using light scanning, they found murals never before seen. One shows a mother holding her child beneath a beam of gold that descends from a painted sky. The Latin inscription beneath reads, Mater Fidelis. The faithful mother. No name. No title. Only faith. In that moment, historians realized something profound. The story of Rome's persecution wasn't just one of cruelty, it was one of survival through compassion. The empire fell, its marble turned to dust, but the songs of those mothers outlived it. Centuries later, one archaeologist, Dr. Emilia Rossi, stood in that chamber and said quietly to her students, "This is where the empire truly ended. Not with fire, but with love that refused to die." The Roman Senate once decreed that memory itself could be punished, a practice called damnatio memoriae, the erasure of a person's name from history. But names like Unia, Prisca, and Lydia now reappear in texts across the catacombs. Rome tried to bury them in silence. History unearthed them in song. Today, the catacombs of Rome draw millions of visitors every year. Some come for faith, others for history. But whether believer or skeptic, everyone who descends into those tunnels feels the same hush, the kind that only comes when human endurance meets time. On one wall, half buried in dust, lies a phrase carved with a trembling hand. "Light came here, once." No one knows who wrote it. But in that single sentence, the centuries of pain, hope, and defiance converge. The story of the persecuted Christians is not only about religion, it's about what happens when people are stripped of everything except conscience. Rome ruled the world, but it could not rule the soul. And so the empire that built roads to every corner of the known world unwittingly paved a path for the very faith it tried to destroy. The catacombs remain silent, yet alive, reminders that truth, once buried, always finds a way back to the light.